Okay, so we're going over just one chapter today, Acts chapter 12. And so because it's just one chapter, we'll go a little more in depth with some of the stuff. So,
No,
what?
he hasn't been here, so he doesn't know what he's doing.
There's going to be blanks. The blanks are going to be highlighted in red, and those are the ones that you fill in.
I was
Is there any multiple choice?
I was
No.
just circling the little bubbles, and he goes, "Is that multiple choice?"
You've given me an idea, though. Maybe I'll give you a test.
Please don't. I'm switching up front. If you give us, we'll go to the little
Make
kid
it
class.
multiple choice. I will get a 25%.
Make
Just
it multiple
what
choice
would you
on
do?
the
Just
two.
put B for all of them?
No,
So you put C.
C.
C's always the answer.
It's because you'll always see the right answer.
Now that you've told me that, I'm not going to have C as the answer for any of them.
And then we'll pick B. And then if you put B as not an
Don't
answer, then
pick
we'll
X.
pick A. I'll just go A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So never mind.
All right, so Acts 12, and this is kind of an important chapter, and this is why I wanted to look at just this chapter by itself, because what we see in this chapter is we see one of the leading figures in the Christian movement get killed. One of the apostles gets killed. And then another one gets imprisoned, and he is going to almost get killed too. And so kind of the gist of this chapter, what it's about, is, okay, so the church is being persecuted. How is the church going to respond? And also what is going to happen to the agitators? What's going to happen to the one who is peddling the persecution? What's going to happen to them? And we'll see all that in this chapter. So this is the outline of what we're going to look at. First few verses, we see that James is killed, and then Peter is imprisoned. Then we'll look at how Peter was freed from prison. And then there's some after effects from Peter getting out of prison. Any questions? All right. So first we're going to look at how James is killed and Peter is imprisoned. This is the first 5 verses of the chapter. So in verse 1, it mentions Herod the king. And there's different Herods in the Bible. This one, if you study history, is Herod Agrippa the First. There's different Herods. There's Herod the Great. There's Herod Antipas. There's 2 Herod Agrippas, actually. We're going to see the other one later in Acts. Paul is going to testify in front of him. And so, you see what I mean? You can't miss it, unless you're just not paying attention. So, this is Herod Agrippa the First. There's an Agrippa the Second who will come up later, but we'll get to him, obviously, later. Herod, kind of a misconception. Herod wasn't a name, but it was a title. And it was a title specifically for the king that ruled over the region of Judea. And so there's Judea, and then there's Samaria. And they kind of, had different kings. And so Herod was the king of the Jews in that sense. Kind of like how Pharaoh isn't a name, but it's a title for an Egyptian king. That's what a Herod is for Judea. It's their king. One thing to mention is that there's different Herods in the Bible, and all of them are bad. If you see the name, or if you see the word Herod come up, then it's usually a bad person. And what's funny is later on in Acts, Paul is going to testify before Herod Agrippa II, but it only calls him Agrippa. It doesn't call him Herod. If it mentions that it's a Herod, that's a bad thing. It's meaning that it's a bad person. So a few examples. Herod the Great is the one who, when Jesus was born, he had all the babies killed. We read about that in Matthew chapter 2. He was the king of the Jews. They said, well, the king of the Jews has been born in Bethlehem. So he tried to have Jesus killed because he viewed that as a threat to his throne. So Herod the Great had all the babies killed. Then there's Herod Antipas, who had John the Baptist beheaded in Matthew 14. So there's all these Herods. Now there's Herod Agrippa, and he's going to do some bad stuff also. So you have Herod the Great, you have Herod Antipas, and you have Herod Agrippa. And if you Google these people, these are real people. And so a lot of this gives more validity to what is happening in the book of Acts. It's a book that tells history. And Luke, the writer, is really good about talking about it's in so-and-so's reign. This king was doing that. This ruler did that, so on and so forth. And so if you look up Herod Agrippa the first, there's actually a Wikipedia page about him. And it talks about his reign and all that. So what we see Herod doing in verse 1, it says, about that time Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. So he's violently persecuting Christians. We don't know how many people he had violence against, but there's one specifically that's mentioned. One thing is that this is the first mention of systemic persecution in the book of Acts. And what that means is it's persecution that comes directly from the government. At this point, the persecution has come from the Jews. The Jews kind of have their own institution, but they're not a government. They don't have the final say over the land. The Roman government does. And now this is coming from a Roman delegated king, who is Herod. And so now this is systemic persecution. It's persecution from the government. And this is going to become a big deal later on. There's going to be Roman emperors like Domitian and Nero who come in and they kill a bunch of Christians. A lot of the apostles are killed, like the apostle Paul is killed by Nero, Peter is killed by Nero, so on and so forth. So, and those are Roman emperors. They're even a step up from who Herod is. So again, at this point, it had been coming from the Jews, but now the king is in on it also. And one thing that's interesting to think about is what would be the king's motivation to do this? Why would the king want to persecute Christians? Linger on that for a few minutes. We'll kind of come to an understanding of that a little later. So he's laying hands on some who belong to the church. And in verse 2, it mentions that he killed James. This is James the apostle. There's different Jameses in the Bible. There's several. But Luke, the writer here, identifies this one as the brother of John. And we know that he was an apostle. One of the first ones actually called by Jesus. Simon and Andrew were the first ones, and then James and John were the second ones. And so, or the second set, I guess. They're the first four that are called. And so James, the brother of John, is killed by Herod. And one thing also about James is when you read through the gospel accounts, James, along with John, his brother, and Peter, make up this inner circle that Jesus had. He has, you could say the 12 apostles are already kind of an inner circle, but then within that there's these three that have more intimate moments with Jesus. And a couple examples of those is that it's these three who went up with Jesus on the mountain and saw him transfigured and saw him there with Moses and with Elijah. It's just the three of them and Jesus that are there. And then also, these three were with Jesus when he was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. And so James is a significant person. He's one of the leaders of the Christian movement. If you had to, and I don't know that it's good to do this, but if you had to have like a pecking order of the apostles at this point, Peter's probably number one, but James is certainly number two or number three. He's up near the top if you want to do something like that. And so this is a significant person to have killed. Now, one thing to notice here is the fact that there's no apostle who's appointed to take his place. Now, this is interesting because we saw in chapter 1 that they replaced Judas. Judas is the one who betrayed Jesus. He turned him in for a bunch of silver coins. He ends up hanging himself and dying, and they replaced Judas after that. So they replaced Judas, but there's no mention of them replacing James, so we assume that they didn't. So why would you replace Judas but not James? Why would you do that? The reason seems to be that Judas was replaced because of his transgression, the bad thing that he did, turning Jesus in. They replaced him because of that, not because of his death. And so this kind of proves that there's a what would you call it? I guess a doctrine out there called apostolic succession. And the Catholics are kind of adherents to this. But there's a lot of what you might call apostolic movements. And apostolic means it's like of the apostles. And what they teach is that, well, there's successors to the apostles, and so there would then be apostles today. And some people call themselves an apostle. But we see that that's not right because they didn't replace James. And so it seems like once they're killed, they've fulfilled their obligation. They've been witnesses for Jesus. And so now James has met his obligation and he has received his heavenly reward. The Catholics use this in relation to the popes. Because they teach that Peter was the first pope, and then there's the successions after that up to, what's his name, Francis, I think, Pope Francis, whoever. But we see that part of, obviously the whole thing's kind of a farce because Peter wasn't a pope, and he doesn't even meet their qualifications. Peter had a wife. But we see that part of their basis for that in this regard is not right. So they've killed James, and now Peter is the next target. We see in verse 3 that Herod targeted Peter because it pleased the Jews. He killed James. It made the Jews happy. The Jews are Herod's constituents, and so now he wants to make them happy again, and so he has Peter arrested. That's kind of, I think, part of Herod's motivation, is to make the people he's ruling over happy so that he can maintain his power over them. You got to kind of do that sometimes. You see that with politicians today. Joe Biden gives out a bunch of free stuff so that people will vote for him again. Every politician does that. That's just normal stuff. And that's what Herod is doing here. It pleased the Jews, and so he goes after Peter now. Luke also mentions that this happened during the days of unleavened bread. This is a holiday that was leading up to the Passover. And so it's during a Jewish festival, which means there's not going to be a trial or an execution until after that festival is over. And so Peter's been arrested, but they can't kill him yet. There's a little bit of time because of this festival that's going on. And that's important because it gives Peter a way out. So Peter's the target, and he's imprisoned. And it mentions here that there are 4 squads of soldiers. And what a squad is 4 guards. That's what that means. So 16 guards, yep. So it's one thing to have someone in like a jail cell. It's another thing to be so heavily guarded. And while Peter is imprisoned, there's also earnest prayer that's made on his behalf. We see in verse 5, Peter's kept in prison. Earnest prayer for him is made to God by the church. And what we're going to see is that these prayers actually work. Peter ends up getting freed. That tells you that God hears our prayers. Any questions on any of that? All right. So now we'll see Peter get freed from prison. In verse 6, it mentions that Herod's going to bring him out on that very night. So this is actually the very night that Peter is going to get killed. He's going to bring him out, and they might have some sham of a trial and then kill him. And it's interesting, on the night that you might die, how would you be feeling and what would you be doing? Most ordinary people would probably be really nervous. They probably wouldn't be able to sleep. But Peter is sleeping. And so he's snoozing in his cell. It says he's sleeping between two soldiers. And one thing that this reminds me of, he's sleeping with imminent danger. He's going to be killed that very night, and he's just sleeping. He doesn't have a care in the world about it. It reminds me of Jesus in the boat from the story in Matthew 8. There's a storm, and the disciples are freaking out, and they wake Jesus up, and they say, "Don't you care that we're perishing?" And Jesus, of course, rebukes them. He says, "You have little faith," and then he calms the storm. And so this is something that Jesus did, and this is something that Peter saw Jesus do, and now he's doing it himself. One thing also to mention is that Peter is as secure in prison as anyone ever has been. Because not only is he locked up, he's in chains, but he's also got all these guards around him, 16 different guards. And the reason for this, I think, is because the Christians probably had a reputation of not being able to stay bound. There's the story we looked at earlier in Acts chapter 5 when the apostles get arrested and then an angel frees them. And of course, the ultimate example is Jesus in the tomb. So they're kind of like they've been wrapped in butter. You can't really get a grip on them. They can't stay bound for very long. So Peter's in prison. He is heavily bound, heavily guarded, and an angel comes and just frees him, nilly-willy. It's kind of funny to read how it happens. The angel wakes him up first because he's sleeping. Then he has him get dressed, and then he ends up leading Peter out of the prison. And he leads him through all the different checkpoints that they have in there. So it says, let's see. They passed the first and second guard. They came to the iron gate leading into the city. It opened for them of its own accord, and they went out and went along one street, and immediately the angel left him. So the angel leads him out. And this all happens so quick. It's to the point where Peter doesn't even know what's going on. In verse 9, it says, he went out and followed him being the angel, and he did not know what was being done by the angel was real, but thought he was seeing a vision. So Peter doesn't really know what's going on. He's just assuming that he's dreaming or he's seeing a vision or something. Because you got to remember, he's just woken him up, and everything's moving very quickly. I don't know about you guys, but me, if I'm woken up, it usually takes me a minute to get my wits about me. So that's kind of what it seems to be happening to Peter. He's kind of confused about what's going on. But then once he's out of prison, he kind of comes to his senses, and he realizes that what has happened, it's not a vision, but it's real, and that the Lord has rescued him. He gives God the credit, because, of course, it's God who did it. So it's the Lord who rescued him from prison. So now that he's out of prison, Peter goes to Mary's house. And the Mary that this is the mother of John Mark. Just like there's a lot of Jameses in the Bible, there's a lot of Marys in the Bible. And this is a new Mary that we haven't seen yet. This is Mary, the mother of John Mark. So he goes to this house, and there's a gateway there with a door to get into the house area. And Peter's there knocking, and there's this servant girl there. Her name is Rhoda. And so Rhoda kind of freaks out because she realizes it's Peter. And she goes and tells the people in the house, because they're in there praying for Peter literally in that moment. And she, imagine this, you're in this house, and you're praying for Peter. And I don't know what specifically they were praying for, but you could assume it's for him to get let out of prison or something along those lines. And suddenly this servant girl comes and says, hey, Peter is knocking at the door. Well, they don't believe her. And it kind of makes you wonder why. Because this is what they're praying for to happen. And when it happens, they don't believe it. And so it makes you wonder, is it the fact that the servant girl maybe wasn't trustworthy because it's a woman and she's just a lowly servant? Or is their faith lacking? Because here they're praying for something, God has done it, and they don't believe it. So kind of a funny thing that happens with this. So they eventually do see that it's Peter, and they let him in. And once he's in the house, Peter tells them about how the Lord had brought him out of prison. So again, he gives God the credit. Then we see, and at the end of verse 17, he said, "Tell these things to James and to the brothers." And then he departed and went to another place. So he tells them to tell James. Well, hang on, wasn't James just killed? Well, this is another James. This is probably James, the brother of Jesus. There's lists in the Gospels of all of Jesus' siblings, and one of them is James. And James actually becomes a pretty prominent person in the church. He's not an apostle, but he's the brother of Jesus. That doesn't mean he has kind of the same divinity as Jesus does, but he becomes a pretty important person. He actually, we'll see him in Acts 15. They have this council that convenes about circumcision, and James is pretty important there. Later in one of Paul's letters, Paul refers to James as a pillar of the church, and he's referring to this James, if it's James the brother of Jesus. And also there's a book in our Bibles, the book of James is probably written by this guy. So it's kind of hard to tell sometimes because there's so many different Jameses. And so now Peter's on the run. He's escaped from prison, and now he's a fugitive, and he's got to get going. And so it mentions here that he went to another place. Any questions on any of that? All right. So now there's some things that happen after Peter gets out of prison. Some of it good, some of it bad. So Peter, obviously, he gets out of prison. And this leads to quite a commotion from the soldiers who were there guarding him. And you can imagine how they were probably feeling. Again, there's never been a more secure person in prison than Peter would have been. Because he's in chains, he's bound, he's sleeping in between these two guards. He's got a guard on either side of him. And then there's all these guards that are guarding doors and so on and so forth. 16 of them are there guarding him. And yet he gets by all of them without a trace. And so they probably were freaking out. How in the world could somebody who is so secured and so guarded break free without a trace? Well, normally that's not how it works. But that's how it was in that instance because the Lord intervened. And so this is a miraculous thing that has happened, and they're trying to wrap their minds around it. It mentions in verse 18, when day came, there was no little disturbance among the soldiers of what had become of Peter. That means there was a big disturbance about it. So there's a big commotion that happens. And part of the commotion is because if they knew that Peter wasn't found, then they would be the ones who would be killed by Herod instead. How this would work a lot of times is there's supposedly a crime that's been committed. In this case, there really wasn't one. But Peter is supposed to get killed. And if he ends up escaping, then it's the people who let him escape who get killed. That's how that worked back then. In this case, there's these 16 people, these 4 squadrons of guards, and he slips by all of them. And so now they're really worried, hey, we got to find this Peter guy, because if he isn't found, then it's going to be us who get killed instead of him. And that's exactly what happens. In verse 19, it says, after Herod searched for him and did not find him, he examined the sentries and ordered that they should be put to death. Those are the guards that were guarding him. And then he went down from Judea to Caesarea and spent some time there. So now there's these guards that are killed because Peter got out. Herod is on the warpath here. A sane person would realize, oh, this is like a divine intervention kind of thing. But Herod, either he is blind to that fact or he just didn't care. So then it mentions in verse 19 that Herod went to Caesarea. Caesarea, if you remember, is where Cornelius was from. And that's where Peter went to convert Cornelius and where the Gentiles heard the gospel for the first time. Caesarea was Herod's primary residence. How it would work is he would go back and forth between Caesarea and usually Jerusalem, probably. And he would kind of, because he's the king over the whole territory, so he would kind of do the rounds going to different places. But Caesarea was his primary residence. That's where a lot of the Roman officials lived at. And he is a Roman official. He answers to Rome, even though he's the king of Judea. And he would often go back and forth from there to Judea to Jerusalem and to various cities in there. And so while he's there at Caesarea, the people of Tyre and Sidon come, and essentially they're sucking up to him is what happens here. It mentions here, verse 20, he's angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, and they came to him with one accord, and having persuaded Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they asked for peace because their country depended on the king's country for food. So Tyre and Sidon depend on Herod for food. Herod gives them food, then they have to suck up to the king in order to keep him happy. That's what's happening here. And so it mentions, on an appointed day, Herod put on his royal robes, he took his seat upon the throne, and he delivered an oration to them. He gives them a speech. And the people were shouting, "The voice of a God and not of a man." So they're sucking up to him. They're telling him what he wants to hear so that they'll feed him, so that he'll feed them. And they even go as far as blaspheming, saying that he is the voice of a God and not of a man. And Herod is just soaking all of this in. He's loving every minute of it. And what it says here that happens is he's taking all of this glory for himself, and he's giving none of it to God. It's funny, for being the king of the Jewish people, the Jews were, religious. He wasn't a very religious person. He was kind of pagan. He worshipped himself a lot of times. And that's what he's doing here. He's giving all the glory to himself. And so he is the center of attention that day. He's in his royal robe. He's seated on the throne. He's giving an oration to them. He's speaking, and they have to listen to what he says. So he's just in the moment, loving every minute of it. And what happens is Herod ends up getting killed. It says, immediately an angel of the Lord struck him down because he did not give God the glory. So Herod is killed. He's struck down by an angel. And eventually, he's eaten by worms. This is one of the weirder deaths in the Bible. And it's funny because a lot of times when you have something like this, it seems like a weird thing because there's divine intervention here. An angel of the Lord strikes him and kills him. I thought, well, I wonder what Herod's Wikipedia page says about this, if it mentions anything about his death. And it actually says that he died unexpectedly, very young. He was only like 44. He'd only been the king for like 3 years at this point. And so he has a really short-lived reign. And even his Wikipedia page says, we don't really know how he died. It was kind of mysterious. Well, that lines up with this. They're not going to know because they don't want it to be from God. So here we see an angel kills him, and he's eaten by these worms. And it's a very humiliating death for a very haughty king, one who's pompous and proud. He dies in a really embarrassing way. So while Herod found his demise, we see in verse 24, but the word of God increased and multiplied. So all of this is happening, and the word of God keeps increasing. And what that means is that the gospel is spreading. The good news is going out to more people. That's what that means. It's going out, it's increasing, and it's multiplying. And there's more people who are becoming Christians. And so what we see happening here is even in the midst of this persecution and this adversity, even when one of your leaders gets killed, the church still prevails. And I have here the reference of Matthew 16 and verse 18. That's when Jesus talks about his church. And he goes on to say, not even the gates of Hades will prevail against it. Nothing will prevail against the church. Not even persecution from Herod or anyone else. And so you have one leader who's killed. You have another one who is in prison and who's bound to be killed. That would be enough to slow down a lot of different things. But it's not enough to slow down the church. Because not even the gates of Hades can prevail against the church. And then the chapter ends. This is kind of looking ahead to the next chapter. The chapter ends by refocusing on Barnabas and Saul. We saw them at the end of chapter 11. They are in Antioch. They're working with the congregation there, and they're teaching them and all of that. They went to Jerusalem to deliver relief for that famine. We saw that at the end of chapter 11. And so they sent this to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. That's chapter 11 and verse 30. So now they're coming back from Jerusalem, and they're coming back to Antioch. And what it says here is that they've brought an extra person back with them, and that person is John Mark. We saw before, earlier in this chapter, that a lot of the disciples were praying in John Mark's mother's house. So John Mark is kind of an important person. Now they bring John Mark back with them. Evidently, they saw enough in John Mark to think that he'd be valuable to bring back with them. John Mark is probably the writer of the book of Mark. One thing is there's a lot of Johns in the Bible also. And so he went by another name. He went by Mark. And he probably wrote the Gospel of Mark. And he probably used Peter as a source for that. At least that's what a lot of tradition says. And so now you have this trio of people. You have Barnabas, you have Saul, and then you have John Mark. Next chapter, these three are going to go on a missionary journey together. They're going to leave Antioch, and they're going to go to these different places in the world, and they're going to convert a bunch of people. So we're kind of looking ahead to chapter 13 now also. So key takeaways. The big one is obviously the fact that even in the midst of this systemic persecution, it's coming from the government, it's coming from the king. Even in the midst of all of this, the church is continuing to grow and to thrive. And I don't want to underscore the significance of James's death because this is very significant. James was an apostle. He's one of the representatives of Jesus, and he gets killed. That's a big deal. But it did not take away from the work of the kingdom. The work keeps going, and even now when there's no apostles, the work of the kingdom continues. And ultimately in this chapter, we see a pretty big contrast. You have, on the one hand, the kingdoms of earth, and you have the king of one of those kingdoms, Herod, and in the blink of an eye, he's gone. And that kind of highlights how temporary the kingdoms of earth are. They're here one day, they're gone with the next. And that's a pretty consistent idea in the Bible. God will bring up kings and he'll tear them down, that kind of a thing. And so the kingdoms of earth pass away, but the kingdom of God is eternal. Not even the gates of Hades will prevail against it. That takes us through chapter 12. Next week, we have chapters 13 and 14. We're going to look at the first missionary journey. Any comments or questions on anything?
Was Agrippa just like a common name?
Yeah, pretty much.
Actually?
Yeah. It would have been a family name.
Yeah.
That's why there's another Agrippa. And there's actually several Agrippas that are in that lineage, but I think it was pretty common.
Several generations of Agrippa.
Yeah. If you go to the Wikipedia page for Herod Agrippa, they have like a family tree on there. And I remember seeing like an Agrippa the Fourth on there. So there's evidently a lot of them.